Okay, well, good evening to everybody. Welcome to our regulars and welcome to any new people who are joining us for the first time this week. We're also welcoming people listening on J-Air as we're now streaming these Australian Jewish Association Zoom sessions on J-Air and via Facebook. If you want to listen to on J-Air, it's 88 FM, or you can listen via the website at j-air.com.au. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I'm the MC again for this evening. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, who's President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Yirmiyahu Danzig, who we will formally introduce in a moment. Our format will be, as we've done before, we're going to chat with Yirmiyahu for about 35 minutes, and we actually do have some slides that we'll talk about, at which point we will open up for questions from the audience. Now, if you're watching via Zoom, the way to ask a question is to raise your hand electronically, and you can do that in the reactions icon down the bottom. But we're now also seeing questions posted on the chat from time to time. And although some of the audience is not shy about personally asking their questions, others might be a little bit uncomfortable about it. So in order not to exclude some very good questions, what we're going to do is the same as last week, which is to read out some of those questions in between the spoken ones. Now, this is going to be done by Robert Gregory, our Research and Advocacy Officer, who's actually recently just become engaged, so I've embarrassed him now, so mazel tov to you, Robert, and to your fiancée. Robert will be the moderator for the written questions, and what he may do is combine some of them if they tend to be on similar themes. Sometimes questions crop up and the speaker actually answers them during the discussion, so in that case, we won't ask the question, we won't repeat it. The chat function is available as usual, and if anybody's not familiar with Zoom, up in the top hand right corner, there's a little icon which says view, and you can toggle between speaker view and gallery view, so you can play with that. Okay, so tucked away on a northwestern corner of Africa is Nigeria, the home of millions of men, women and children who identify as the sons and daughters of Israel. Not only have the Igbo people suffered a genocide inspired by anti-Semitic tropes, but they struggle to this very day against a government willing to regularly raid synagogues and abuse this openly Jewish community. None of this is helped, of course, by Nigeria's lawlessness, its status as a failed state, and the activities of the Islamic Boko Haram terrorising and slaughtering people with barely a whimper from the international community or the news services. We all know about that. We're all familiar too with the plight of the Falasha Ethiopian Jews at the time, and how Israel evacuated and repatriated them to Israel in the 1980s in a project called Operation Moses. So what's the story of these Nigerian people who identify as Jewish? Well, to hear more about this, we're pleased to have Yirmiyahu Danzig in Israel joining us, and he advocates for the Igbo people. Yirmiyahu is an Israeli activist, and you'll tell from his accent that he wasn't born there. He's an activist for Jewish and Indigenous rights. He is a writer and speaker specialising in Jewish diversity and identity. He is the Director of Education for the Hirut movement in the World Zionist Organization. Yirmiyahu is of Caribbean, Ashkenazi and Palestinian Jewish descent. He served as a squad commander in the counter-terrorist unit of the Israel Border Police, and he has a BA in political science, homeland security and public diplomacy from the IDC in Herzliya. Yirmiyahu, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to Australia via Zoom.
Thank you for having me. I didn't think the first time I'd be in Australia would be over Zoom, but you know, life can surprise you. Okay, so now we're going to start
with a little bit of history and geography. So I've got the slides you've sent me, and I've turned them into a PowerPoint show. So I'm going to put them up, and we'll just talk about them as we go. And where are we? Can everybody see that? I hope you can. Okay, so Yirmiyahu, let's start with the history and the geography. Why am I not changing slides? I've got to do that. Okay, let's just start with that. So tell us a little bit, what are we looking at, and what does this actually mean for the Igbo people?
Sure. So first, I'd like to give a little bit of context to what we're seeing on the screen, right? It says DNA ? And this is something which I generally finish this type of discussion with, because often, one of the questions that are asked is, now that we know that there is such a thing as Jewish DNA, the question is, okay, so have there been studies done on the Igbo, and what does their DNA say? And the question is the answer to that question is no, there have not been any comprehensive DNA studies on the Igbo, but individual Igbos, all of the individual Igbos that I know, when they've taken these tests, get this type of map. And so when we're looking at the Jewish dispersion throughout the world, often we understand that Jews were sent or fled to, or were taken by force to the four corners of the world, right? This is something which is echoed throughout the prophetic writings, and we know it from history. When we discuss the Jewish presence in Africa, until the growing awareness of the history of Jews in Ethiopia, the conventional wisdom was that Jews were mostly concentrated in the Mediterranean basin. And for Africa, that meant the northern extremity of Africa. As for sub-Saharan Africa, either it never came up in popular discourse, or whenever anybody mentioned it, it was in the realm of myth or just dismissed completely. But when we actually look at the historical records, both Jewish internal records and external records from Muslim, Christian, African, and European explorers and political entities, we do see that there is a documented Israelite and Jewish presence within the interior of Africa, in the sub-Saharan region. And so where the question is there a connection between that historical presence and this phenomenon of Jewish Hebrew identification amongst the Igbo in present-day Nigeria? And so we're thinking about where Jewish communities historically existed, and the vast majority of those communities have since returned to Israel. We're talking about all of North Africa, from Morocco all the way to Egypt, mostly on the coastline, but also in the interior of those countries. We have the presence of Jewish merchants, of communities, which included synagogues, and those communities traveled often. And so just south of that, we have Nigeria, and in the southeastern corner, we have this historical Igbo population, which we are going to be discussing today. Okay.
I've got a little bit of echo there. Let's look at the next slide. And I did change Yirmiyahu's slides around, everybody. So perhaps that wasn't the best thing to do. But what can you tell us about this part of the continent?
Right, so we just spoke a little bit more generally about Jewish geography and dispersion of Jewish communities on the African continent. And this makes it very clear that whether we're talking about, what period the Jewish communities were migrating or being exiled, there was a clear connection between the historical Jewish community of the Songhai Empire, though its capital was in Timbuktu, and what became Igbo land, which is the population concentration of the Igbo people. So we can see here on this map, the capital of what was the Songhai Empire, which was a Muslim empire in the region, Timbuktu, which sits on the Niger River, what the British then later called the Niger River. And from that capital to Igbo land, it is a straight shot on that river. And we know that the Timbuktu was home to a small yet thriving Jewish community. They had a chief rabbi up until the late 1880s. And we know that there was trade going from that region south. And until 1492, where obviously we knew, most Jews at least know that date, 1492, as the mass expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, specifically from Spain, and then after that Portugal. But in 1492, there was another anti-Semitic expulsion of Jews, and that was from the Songhai Empire. Askia Muhammad was an Islamist reformer, and he was a part of his attempt to radicalize the population, to make the population more conservative and more Islamic in its dispensation. He demanded that the large Jewish population of the Songhai Empire be expelled. And while some of those communities might have dispersed north, more likely because they were trying to escape Islamism and not go into other Islamic lands, most scholars speculate that they went south. What happened to those communities, we do not have documentation, but there's a lot of people that theorize that they joined a already present population of Hebrews in what is present-day Igbo land in southeastern Nigeria.
Okay, so now Nigeria itself is not actually an ancient country, is it? So how does the history of Nigeria affect what we're talking about? Or does it affect what we're talking about?
It affects it in a very stark way. So Nigeria, like most African countries as they exist today, with the exception of, say, Liberia and Ethiopia, were basically carved on a map by European powers. And most people are familiar with the Berlin Conference, where the European powers sat in Berlin and basically just divided up the map of Africa like a cake. They decided, okay, we're going to take this area, you're going to take that, with no consideration whatsoever for the actual political, ethnic, and religious realities on the ground in these regions. And Nigeria is perhaps one of the most tragic examples of this. So when the British came and decided in 1914, this is going to be Nigeria, they forced together three large ethnic groups. The Hausa Fulani, which were a Muslim conglomerate, the Yoruba, which today are split between Islam and Christianity, but are their own unique ethnic group with their own interests and their own culture, and the Igbo, who were the minority of the three. And Nigeria forced them to come together, and this got basically increasingly worse with the development of colonialism, because the British, like other European powers in the region, wanted to create a hierarchy which they would be able to divide and rule the population. And the Igbos, for various reasons, were selected to play this buffer role between the British colonialists and the rest of the population, the Yoruba and the Hausa Fulani. And the reason why they said that they were doing this is because the Igbo were a minority. They were known to be businessmen. They were known to be good with money, and they were known to be good with political power. These were the tropes that the British cast on this group, and the rest of the tribes agreed with it. And so then it just basically created a trajectory that within the Nigerian state, there would be an increasing marginalization of the Igbo. And this is something that kind of came to a horrible, tragic outcome in 1966, which was the mass pogroms, which led to the slaughter of 30,000 Igbo within a few weeks, which was immediately precipitated by the Biafran War, which we will probably discuss a little bit more later.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about the Biafran War, because that seems to crop up in the history about that time. How did that affect the Igbo people?
So it's important to understand that all three of these ethnic groups had autonomous regions, right? The Igbo were in Igbo land, the Yoruba were in Yoruba land, the Hausa were in Hausa land, and their interaction was limited. It was mostly on the borderlands, and it was full of conflict. Nigeria forced all of them to come together, and in forcing them to come together, the Igbo then became this kind of middleman within the Nigerian society and politics. And in 1966, there was an attempted coup. And this coup had representation from basically all of the ethnic groups that were not part of the Hausa ruling majority, the Muslim ruling majority. Yet it was entirely blamed on the Igbo. Similar to what we can say, like with the Marxist revolution was seen as a Jewish revolution by anti-Semites, the coup in 1966 was seen as completely something of an Igbo plot, and the immediate response to that was horrible pogroms throughout all of Nigeria, which caused a mass exodus of Igbo from the northern parts of the country to the southeast where the Igbo homeland was. And what happened was the Igbo said, enough is enough. We cannot be a part of this Nigerian experiment. We are our own unique people. We have our own unique history. They were also explicit in the fact that they identified that history as coming from Israel, and that the fact that they were Hebrews, that they were from the Jewish homeland originally. And what happened was the Nigerian government said, okay, that's what you're going to do. We are going to bomb your civilian populations. We are going to starve and completely blockade this population, to the point that within a period of a few years, between 1 to 3 million Igbos, mostly civilians, were killed, were either murdered or starved to death. And this very much solidified within the Igbo psyche that, number one, that they are a unique people with their own sense of self and destiny. And number two, that their Hebrew identity that they grew up hearing about from their parents and grandparents wasn't something that was, just a cute aspect of their past. Rather, it is something which is central to their historical experience, because they saw the parallels with their experience as Igbo Hebrews in Nigeria with that of Jews in the rest of the global diaspora.
And I mean, what Igbo would consider themselves Nigerian by nationality, would they?
So look, today it very much depends. The Biafran War left a very traumatic mark on the Igbo society and psyche. A lot of people leading up to Biafran independence and then the war were mostly on the same page. It was almost unanimous amongst the Igbo society that this is what we need to do in order to survive, and we deserve it. The tragic outcome of the Biafran War left the Igbo society very much divided, in the sense that they felt that they had to become part of Nigeria. That some of the members of society blamed the genocide, blamed the failure of Biafra on Igbo nationalism, and as a result, many Igbo today identify as Nigerian. They identify as part of the Nigerian society. However, that has changed in the last decade. In the last decade, really in the last 5 to 6 years, there has been a reawakening of a sense of Igbo nationalism, a sense of Igbo identity politics, if you will. And so the relationship with Nigeria and Nigerian identity has become very sensitive and controversial.
And would there be a difference in language, for example? I mean, do people in Nigeria speak different dialects of what language is it?
It's really separate languages completely, right? So Igbo speak Igbo language, the Yoruba speak a Yoruba language, and the Hausa speak Hausa. When they come together in the government, they speak English, right? Which is kind of something which is, you could see it in any African country, right? In certain countries, they all speak French to each other. In other countries, like Angola, they speak Spanish, or I'm sorry, Portuguese. This is the model throughout Africa, and in Nigeria, it becomes very painful, because in order to become Nigerian, you have to erase part of what it means to be Igbo, not only religious, culturally, and spiritually, but also linguistically. And that has definitely contributed to the sense of Igbo alienation from the Nigerian state.
Okay, so let's talk about the connection to Judaism, and I've got this slide. Tell me what this is all about, Yirmiyahu.
Okay, so first thing, let's talk about history from the Western perspective, right? Because we're having a conversation in English, from in Western states, so it makes sense that we'd understand history from this perspective, and then we'll get into the Igbo sense or the Jewish sense of historiography. So from the Western perspective, the concept of an Igbo Jewish identity really begins with the onset of slavery. Already in the 16th century, we have the Spanish, Portuguese, and then British enslavement of peoples from the region of Igbo land, and the kidnapping them, taking them to the New World. And already in that period, we have the first ethnographic studies of the slave populations in the Caribbean. And one of the first things that these European ethnographers noticed about when they were doing their survey of the various ethnic groups that were enslaved, they said there was one ethnic group that is very zealous about circumcision. And not just circumcision, but circumcision on the 8th day. And they see it as something which isn't so much a ritual, rather it's a rite of initiation, that anybody who does not have circumcision and not circumcised on the 8th day is considered somebody that they can't even communicate with, right? There was a clear sense of a unifying identity that was based on this idea. And that ethnic group was identified by them as the Igbo. And not long after this, we have the first basically written document by an Igbo himself who was liberated, emancipated from slavery in the UK. And his name was Alauda Quino. Gustavus Vasa was also one of the names he was known by. And he wrote about what it was like to be someone who was kidnapped from Igbo land, taken to European society, and then to explain what it was like to be a person who went from freedom to slavery and to basically lobby against slavery. And he explicitly, in his description of Igbo life, drew a direct parallel. He said, what we did growing up is exactly what I see the Jews in London doing. The way we wake up in the morning and we wash our hands first thing, the holidays and when we celebrate them, the various sacrifices and when and how we do them. All these things are basically copy and paste from the Tanakh, from the Torah, and the way of life that is described by the Israelites and that is still lived out by the Jews in the diaspora. And so at the same time as we have that happening in London, we also have Igbos in the Caribbean and in the New World coming up and saying, hey, we are Hebrews, we are Jews, and starting to join and to create synagogues and communities where they began to live out their Jewish experience. So this is from the perspective of Western historiography, and that led more British colonialists on the ground in Igbo land to actually conduct ethnographic studies. So to go onto the ground, famous missionaries like Thomas Basden would go in and study the Igbo way of life, and he would document meticulously how these different sacrificial rites were performed, how the laws of menstrual seclusion were performed, what holidays they had, and he would draw the direct parallel across the board to the things that were explained in the Torah, specifically in the book of Vayikra and Leviticus, how most, if not all of these things can be seen with direct parallels in the Torah, and something that we cannot say exists for any other population which was colonized on the African continent.
So this guy was captured in Africa, sent back to Europe as a slave, and he looked around and he saw Jews doing what he used to do back in Africa. That must have been quite a revelation.
Precisely, right? So that was exactly the point for him, is that, you know, he was seeing the society in London with its small minority of a Jewish population during that time period, and hearing people discuss all of his people, right, all of these displaced people from Africa, as somebody with no connection whatsoever to Western civilization. He said that is just simply not true, right? If you Western civilization view the Jews as part of the main contributors to your civilization, your culture, then we are also a part of that contribution. We also are a part of that Abrahamic line. And this is something which then was picked up by many people within the growing abolitionist society, for them to say, hey, African society isn't a monolith. There are many different peoples with many different backgrounds. There are Muslims, there are Christians, there are animists, and there are also Hebrews. And we need to recognize this and start to treat Africans like we would expect anybody to treat people with diverse civilizations like we do in Europe or in any other part of the world.
Well, it must have been equally as confronting for the masters, if you like, if they had an Igbo slave, like a Jewish master, and they're starting to prepare for Shabbat or some Chag or something like that, and the Igbo slave comes along and says, "You're doing what I used to do." That must have been quite mind-boggling for both sides.
Certainly, and the reality is that unfortunately we don't have a lot of historical records. We have no historical records documenting an interaction of that sort. But we do have a very similar history with the history of the Ethiopian Jewry, right? In the 16th century, we have the Radbaz, the chief rabbi of Cairo, if I'm not mistaken. And all of a sudden, he has Jews coming up to him from his community and saying, "Hey, Rabbi, we just bought a bunch of slaves from the slave market in Cairo, and they're telling us that they're Jews from the tribe of Dan in Ethiopia. What do we have to do?" And after he did his research, he found out that there's a massive population of Jews in Ethiopia that had their own independent kingdom, and that he was explaining to his congregation members that we have an obligation not only to buy these slaves, but to free them and to make them a part of our communities and to marry with them.
Okay, what's all this about, Yirmiyahu?
So
we're looking at a slide with, sorry, I'll just for our JAIR listeners, we're looking at a slide with some Hebrew text.
So we spoke briefly about the first European contacts with this Jewish identification among the Igbo. Let's speak about this from the Jewish perspective of history. We understand that in 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. And the reason why we identify as Jews today is because by and large, the Jewish community throughout the world are descendants of those who survived in the kingdom of Judea. Those 10 tribes, really the majority of our nation, that were exiled and or destroyed by the Assyrians become an asterisk in Jewish history. But something that was clearly maintained as a part of our oral tradition that is recorded in the Talmud. So in the Talmud and Masechet, in Tractate Sanhedrin 94a, there's a discussion, what happened to the 10 northern tribes? And Mar Zutra, who is one of the most important figures of the Gemara, says, we have it within our tradition that the 10 tribes were taken to what he calls Afriki, right? Africa. And that's identified today as being within North Africa. And we know that by the time the Jewish diaspora forms these communities in North Africa, that those 10 tribes are no longer there. And so then it became part of at least an afterthought of Judean life, culture, and society, that the 10 tribes would be somewhere in that region. These suspicions were confirmed by the person of Eldad Hadani. Eldad from the tribe of Dan, who comes out of sub-Saharan Africa, specifically the area of between Sudan and Ethiopia, into the Jewish world in the 9th century. And he says, guys, not only are your suspicions correct, there are a lot of the 10 northern tribes in the region that I live. And he makes specific reference to the tribe of Dan, to the tribe of Gad, Naphtali, and Zebulun. And so all of a sudden, this idea spreads throughout the Jewish world. And various scholars, particularly those who are really versed in the Talmud, in Jewish history, in halakha, have an understanding that the 10 tribes are somewhere within the interior in Africa. And at some point in Jewish history, as we understand from our prophets, we have to reunite with them. And so what we are looking at here are 2 letters that are written in the 1800s by the chief Sephardic rabbi of London and the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of London. And that they sent these letters amongst British explorers that were on their way to the river Niger, specifically the region where we know the Igbos were living. We don't know what happened with these letters, but we do know they were sent among there because the chief rabbis of the UK of that time period believed that on the river Niger, there would be descendants of the northern tribes, and they just happened to be where the Igbo had settled.
Okay, so let's just talk about today, and I'm going to put up some general photos of people doing very Jewish-looking things, only they happen to be African. What's life like for the Igbo people today? And when you say that they practice as Hebrews, what does that entail? Does that mean going to shul? Does it mean eating kosher food? Tell us what it's like.
So what the British missionaries and explorers and slavers, what they identified amongst the Igbo lifestyle was very clearly something which was taken directly and shockingly so from the biblical period of Hebrew life. The sacrificial system, the system of some menstrual seclusion, the ways in which they worshipped the oneness of God were things that were basically taken exactly like out of the patriarchal period of Hebrew history. And almost as an animus against this Israelite lifestyle, practice, and religion, it motivated the British missionaries to Christianize them, to convert them in a way in which they did not attempt to, or definitely did not succeed to attempt to, amongst the other tribes in the region. The Yoruba, they succeeded partially, and with the Muslims in the north, they pretty much didn't even try. With the Igbo, because they identified them as having Israelite identity and practice, they made it their mission to forcefully and violently convert them to Christianity. And unfortunately, by basically the mid 19th century, they had succeeded in Christianizing the majority of the population. But today, we see something very different. In the post Biafran genocide period, most Igbo said, okay, we're not allowed to have our political sovereignty. We're not allowed to have any type of cultural sovereignty. We need to at least have spiritual autonomy. And this was basically seen by many leaders within the Igbo community as an opportunity to return to their ancestral religion. But because there was this break between the period of them observing what they call omenana, which literally is how they described their culture and faith, what would be literally translated as things you do in the land, which is literally a quote taken from the book of Deuteronomy. They said, okay, we have had this break between us and our ancestral religion. What's the closest thing that we can do? We can do Judaism, right? We see that there are Jews who have preserved the Israelite faith throughout the world. Through the internet, through individual relationships with Jews, we are going to start living Jewishly. And so today in Igbo land, you have around 70 synagogues throughout the area. You walk around the country, you can see people walking around with the Star of David, with Magen David, with a kippah, with tzitzit, doing the holidays on the same exact days that we do them, going to synagogue and praying in the same way that we do. And this is something which somewhere between 15,000 to 30,000 Igbos are living their life and are practicing Judaism, and millions more are basically on a spectrum in between their basically the Christianized version of their lifestyle and the Jewish version, which we are more familiar with.
And is kosher food available in that part of the world?
To a certain extent, right? So Chabad has a presence in Nigeria. I know some Igbo Jews that get their food from Chabad, that attend Chabad, but a lot of it has to be very autonomous. There are people that basically only eat vegetarian because they have no access to kosher meat. I know some individuals have studied kosher slaughter, but it's very difficult to live Jewishly in Nigeria.
Yes, no, just you've talked about Igbo land. Is there a Hebrew word for that?
So for them, they see the term Igbo as being an evolution of the original term Ivri, right, or Ibri. So they see Igbo as really being a kind of creolization of that term itself. So when they say Igbo land, they're in their minds are saying Hebrew land.
Ah, okay. Okay, so just before we go to some questions, I want to ask you about, and you've touched on anti-Semitism, but there was an incident in August of this year where a leader of one of the one of the leaders of the Igbo people was jailed for a month without charge after being arrested with 3 visitors from Israel. Tell us the story, Yirmiyahu.
So starting in 2015, really even before that, there's this kind of awakening of Igbo nationalism again. And one of the key figures of that group, as a part of him reminding the Igbo people that they are their own autonomous, unique nation with roots in the land of Israel, really took it upon himself to really embrace Judaism, right? He's saying it's not enough for us to talk about us being unique people with a unique history that have suffered anti-Semitism in the Nigerian state. We also have to embrace our Jewish identity. So he started walking around with a talit, with a kippah, with a big Star of David. And so his lifestyle, in addition with his political activism, became a symbol for the whole Igbo society. The unfortunate product of that was that the Nigerian state then identified Jewish identification as a direct threat to their own internal stability and security. And so basically in June, right after that individual who took the Jewish identity and the political autonomy movement and put them together, right after he was arrested and jailed for the second time in Nigeria, a team of Israelis, including my friend, went to Nigeria to support the Jewish community, basically just to learn from them and to hear their side of Jewish history. They were jailed alongside one of the leaders of the synagogues. And unfortunately, this is just one story of really a trend of what has been a consistent raiding of synagogues, the jailing and even the murder of people that are visibly Jewish in Igbo land and throughout Nigeria.
Right. Okay, we'll go to questions in a moment, but just to remind everybody, and if you're listening to us on J-Air, this is a live simulcast of the Australian Jewish Association, a Zoom event, which we have every Wednesday night. And our guest tonight is Yirmiyahu Danzig, who's discussing the history, culture and religion of the Igbo Jews of Nigeria. I'm just going to hand over to David for a quick moment to tell us a little bit about next week, and then we'll go straight into questions. David. David, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Next week, we're fortunate to have one of the most sought-after experts in international security, Middle East security, Jonathan Spire, and we'll be talking about the existential threats facing Israel, specifically the threats from Iran, which obviously have had a lot of publicity recently, but also Turkey and the rise of Russian presence and Chinese presence in the Middle East with the pullback of the Americans. So that has obvious significant implications to Israel, because all of those countries are supporting forces hostile to Israel. And finally, the important advertisement for AJA. If there's anybody here who has not yet applied for membership of AJA or made a contribution, please go to the website jewishassociation.org.au. Consider becoming a financial member. It's only $25, or making a donation. And if you want our latest news and views on an ongoing basis, the easiest way to do that is to like and follow the AJA page.
Good, thanks, David. Now, I think do you have any questions for Yirmiyahu?
Yes, I've got a few, but I'll just ask one at this stage. Yirmiyahu, there is a significant fundamentalist Islamic community in Nigeria, one of the most aggressive groups, Boko Haram, which is known for its violence. These sort of people tend to be extremely anti-Semitic, although they have turned their attention to Christian communities. Are they a threat to the Igbos?
Very much so, right? So it's important to understand the history of Islamism, of radical expressions of Islam, is very old in Nigeria. The first premier of the northern region, which is where the Muslim population is centralized, Ahmadu Bello, he was one of the first people within the Nigerian government to basically give an official stamp of approval to anti-Semitism. He said, if you throw an Igbo even into a camp for laborers, within a short matter of time, the Igbo will end up controlling everything because that's their nature, right? So this very classic anti-Semitic trope has become the way in which not only Muslim populations in Nigeria view the Igbo, but basically all non-Igbo, the way that they understand the position of the Igbo. So it's created a situation in which groups like Boko Haram and now increasingly the Fulani herdsmen, really Fulani terrorists, from their inspiration of Boko Haram, have gone in and killed many Igbo, and specifically with an anti-Semitic animus.
Thanks. Yirmiyahu, would there be relative harmony between the religions? You know, would the Igbo people get together with the Christians and perhaps some of the Muslim communities in their local areas?
Well, this was part of the tragedy of the Biafran War, or the Biafran genocide, I should say. Up until 1966, there was a lot of people that really believed that this Nigerian experiment is working. A lot of people describe their lives, I'm talking about Igbos, describing their lives in the northern region up until 1966 as harmonious. When they would have lunch with their neighbors, they would go to the market together, and most often, those neighbors were not Igbo. They were Hausa, they were, Yoruba, depending on the region and the scenario. But in 1966, we have countless stories of neighbors going into Igbo homes and slaughtering the entire family. And so today, there are a lot of relationships between Igbo and non-Igbos in the Nigerian state. There's Igbos have been, they contribute in music, in culture. Nollywood, right, which is the third biggest film industry after Hollywood and Bollywood, is seen by most Nigerians as an Igbo industry, right, ironically. So Igbos are a part of the Nigerian country, culture, and society. The problem is that it's always followed with this undercurrent and sometimes violent expression of anti-Semitism.
Okay, we'll go to questions. I've got Ron, Saul, Anne, and that looks like Anthony, Cohen, and Jeff, and we'll see if there's any written questions in there as well. Okay, Ron, you've unmuted yourself. Please ask your question.
Yirmiyahu, thank you very much for a fascinating elaboration of the Igbo people. I actually attended a pro-Igbo demonstration when I was a student, when I just left school in 1968. So they've always been something, very interesting topic for me. I want to know if the Igbos also coordinate and support and get support from African Jewish communities, the Lemba in Southern Africa, and the Aba Udaya in Uganda. Do they work together?
So, first of all, thank you very much. And it's always, often when I have this conversation with fellow Jews, a lot of people was like, wow, I was active in supporting the Biafran cause in the 60s and in the 70s. And then only later I found out that there was actually this reality of Jewish identification of Hebrew history in the Igbo people and in their land. So it's really amazing to hear that. And thank you for your question. So unfortunately, because of the material reality on the ground in Nigeria, we're really dealing with a lot of lack of resources. And insofar as the Jewish world has largely been ignorant and non-participant in helping the Igbo people return back to their ancestral culture and to unite with their fellow Jews, likewise, there's not a lot of official connections between the Aba Udaya, which is the Jewish community in Uganda, and also Lemba, the Jewish community in Zimbabwe/South Africa. There are individual relationships, but to my knowledge, nothing official, organized.
Okay, thank you. Saul, we'll take you. Robert, if you've got any written questions, please hit the raise hand button so that we can come to you after Saul. Fire away, Saul.
Yeah, thank you, Yirmiyahu. Very, very interesting. Do you think when you look at the origins of the Judaism as a belief and Jewish people possibly among the Igbo, that one can trace it back as far as the Phoenicians, who established a colony, of course, in North Africa, just outside Tunis? That was, of course, Carthage. We call it Carthage. The Romans called it Carthago. They called it Kiryat Chadash, which anyone speaking Hebrew would be able straight away to know what Kiryat Chadash means. So here you have a Semitic-speaking people closely linked to the Jews, and they established a colony in North Africa. The Carthaginians also did that about 800 or so BCE, and they traded round the Pillars of Hercules, round the bulge of Africa. Certainly they were getting gold from Ghana and from Sierra Leone. So do you think that that could also be a factor in the origins of the Igbo people?
Thank you for the question, Saul. So first thing, I think it's very important, a historical point that you made about the very ancient relationship between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. Often we perpetuate this myth that you have North Africa, which is entirely separate, and then Sub-Saharan Africa, which is an entirely different thing. Historically, that wasn't the case. There was migrations going between these regions. Quite often, the borders were not drawn in any way that we recognize today. And so as a result, there was lots of population movements within those regions. As for the actual theory of there being a connection between the two, I'm much more likely, and by the way, it's very difficult to know exactly how the Igbos arrived in Igbo land, where this Hebrew identity specifically came from. In the same sense that it's very difficult for us to know when Jews first came to Ethiopia, when Israelite populations first settled in northern India, and that's because their history is very, very ancient. I think with the amount of evidence we have from Igbo oral historians, they clearly had an oral tradition of being descended of the northern tribes of Israel. To my knowledge, the Carthaginians had a more expressed Canaanite identity. And so it's very possible that there was some overlap. By Canaanite, I mean Phoenician, right? Northern Canaanite. So if there's a specific connection between the two, it's entirely possible. But I think it's much more likely that we're talking about a population, a founding population, which came from the northern kingdom of Israel. And there's various reasons. There's cultural overlap between Igbo traditions and customs and those that we see from other communities that have northern Israelite ancestry, such as the Beta Israel in Ethiopia, the Samaritans in Israel, and the Bene Israel in southern India.
Okay, thanks, Yirmiyahu. Now we'll take a couple of written questions from Robert, and then we'll go to Arne, Anthony, and Jeff.
Thanks, Yirmiyahu. It's been a really interesting presentation. And I would say not many people know, but one of the filmmakers you mentioned who was arrested actually studied here in Australia. So Andrew Liebman, I studied in university with him. So we were all very worried about him for a bit. But we just had a couple of questions. So one of them is, do the Igbo want to make Aliyah? Are they interested in moving to Israel?
So as a whole, first of all, thank you. I know Andrew personally as well. So I will, I'll say hi for you. As a whole, no. And the reason is that they've been in Igbo land isolated for so long that they have developed a very intense and meaningful relationship with the land itself, right? If we discuss, what's the center of Jewish identity, it's the Torah of Israel, the God of Israel, and the land of Israel, right? And so when the Igbos settled in that region and they were given the ability just for historical and geographical circumstances to really isolate in some ways, they replicated the same model. God of Israel, right, what they call Chiuku, which is the source of all creation, of all spirit in their language. The people itself, right, the Indi, as they call it, and the land. And they called, whenever they described their culture, religion, spirituality, they called the things we do in the land. They were separated from the land of Israel. So they said, we're going to do it in this land here. So as a result of that historical process of basically taking the lifestyle of the Torah and doing it in this land, they have kind of bound themselves with that land in many different ways. at the very least at a very deep psychological level. So because of that, the majority of Igbo, what they really want is a Hebrew state in the southeast. And that's kind of the conflict between them and the government about this idea of Nigerian unity and stability, as opposed to this desire to kind of fragment. On the other hand, and it's important to mention, there are Igbos in Israel today. Since the 1960s, this is a whole different part of Igbo history about what the Israeli government has known about the Igbo in the past, and our relationship with the Igbo from before the founding of the State of Israel until today is a very interesting topic. But as a result of those relationships, we have had Igbos in the country. Some Igbos have served in the military, and basically are multiple generations now in the country. So they do have an affinity for Israel. They want a strengthen the relationship between the state and the people. But as a whole, there isn't a desire for a mass migration.
Okay, thanks. Robert, have you got another question, or is that it?
I've just had a couple of comments. Someone's asked if you know any Igbo in Australia, and an Igbo Jew in Australia has gotten involved, so that's nice to see. And someone else has asked, what type of surnames and first names do the Igbo have? How are they structured?
So all of the very common thing for Igbo first names is just how we have the name of God, right? We use the term either El or the Tetragrammaton, the Yud He Vav He, in our names. They have basically the same thing, right? So all of their names have some type of evocation of the creator, of the God of Israel. So that's the point for the first names. As for the surnames, it often depends on the clan and the region they come from, because basically Igbo society prior to colonialism was structured very Republican. One of the main things that the first things that the British identified when they came to the region is they said, okay, the other groups are structured very hierarchically. Basically, they had like either a monarch or some clan leader, whereas the Igbos were structured very Republican. That there was the concept of having a court where all of the elders could chime in, which is again very similar to this type of structure we can see among the people of Israel during the period of the judges or even before that.
Okay, thanks. It's fascinating. Arne, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, guys. Yeah. So in Nigeria, I was reading on Open Doors USA that there's been a Christian persecution in Nigeria. Has that affected the Jewish community in Nigeria? And more specifically, has there been some kind of imposed jizya? And this comes from Quran chapter 9, verse 29. It says to fight the Christians and Jews unless they pay the jizya with willing submission. Has the jizya been imposed in countries such as Nigeria and other Islamic majority countries, should we say?
So, as was mentioned before, Nigeria in many parts of the country is very much a failed state. There are places that are quite lawless, and in that vacuum, groups like Boko Haram and others with very similar Islamist tendencies have imposed Islamic law, which includes the jizya. And often, the statistics we get about the number of Christians that have been killed by either the Fulani terrorists or by Boko Haram include Igbos.
Okay, thank you. So Anthony, we'll come to you if you can unmute yourself. Just while you're doing that, I will mention that in a couple of minutes' time, listeners to J-Air will revert back to their station programming, so you may lose the conversation partway. Apologies for that, but thank you for joining us. And now, Anthony, please ask your question.
Thank you very much, Yirmiyahu. It's very interesting. Tell me, is there an official Israeli attitude towards the Igbo people? And I say that because you describe them as they are fairly happily settled where they are in their lifestyle, but then that's the history of the Jews all over the world, and eventually, as C follows B follows A, they were forced to try and find somewhere to live. Does Israel have a definite policy towards them?
So basically, in terms of anything official and legal, first of all, thank you for the question. It's a very pertinent one. Unfortunately, the question of the Jewish identity of the Igbo came up in the Supreme Court. Believe it was in the early 2000s, and basically because of lack of interest for so many different internal political reasons, they brought some quote unquote experts of the Igbo who had spent no time, like zero time, actually studying the Igbo and their history, to come in and say basically the Igbo have no legitimate connection with the people of Israel, and therefore they can be here, you know, as migrant workers, but nothing more than that. And that's basically where it's been left up until recently. So as a result of that, the Jewish Igbo community in Israel, many of them were tragically deported. Those that for various reasons were able to get around it are officially citizens of the state, but not because of any government policy or recognition. Some things are changing. You know, a few years ago on the Holocaust Remembrance Day, on Yom HaShoah, then Prime Minister Netanyahu started off by making a reference to the Biafran genocide. And there is an increasing awareness right now. So I really believe that the onus is on us, on our generations of Jews that are interested in helping our brothers and sisters, that we continue to lobby, to speak about this issue, because it is an integral part of our past, present, and it must be part of our future, because the Igbo are our brothers and sisters of Israel, and they deserve just as much as any of us deserve to be a part of this great nation and official policy going forward.
Yes, absolutely. Jeff, we've got time to take your questions, so please unmute yourself.
Hi, Shalom. I would have thought that the greatest disincentive to staying in place, not being happy with settling on the land, is the mass murder of 30,000 plus and the ever-present danger of the Perku Haram or whatever their cursed name is. I would have thought that they could have found that less than a desirable place, given that Nigeria's greatest national product, or the third greatest national product, is fraud. I would have thought they would have found a natural
Okay, Jeff, what's your question?
I'll get to it. Yeah,
No, we're running out of time, Jeff.
I know that in 3 seconds more. You don't have to tell me that. The greatest incentive is to actually contemplate that there's a better home for them in Israel. This is a replication of a previous question. Together with the 30,000 mass murder, I would have thought it was a no contest. I asked, this is a shorter question than most of the others, by the way.
So Yirmiyahu, I mean, that's a fair point. I mean, given the violence and the difficulties that's inherent in that part of Africa, all of Africa, most of Africa, wouldn't you think that that the Igbo people might look a bit north and say, hang on, there's a more natural place for us to be living?
Look, some of them are, right? But today we are living in this kind of post-Zionist revolution period, right? Not in the sense that Zionism is no longer relevant. It's very relevant, but in the sense that we benefit from a revolutionary change in Jewish life where a collective generation decided it was time to return home. Before that, this was not something which was taken for granted, right? There were just as many Jews throughout the world, didn't matter where they were in the diaspora, which had different theories for what they needed to do to improve Jewish life. A lot of people know about the Bund and their concept of Doakite, right, of here-ness, you know, that they said, no, we need to stay here. Even though we are a unique people, we can do this here. We can free ourselves here. And the only way that we change that is the same way as we did with the Zionist revolution. We started actually communicating with each other, advocating our ideas, having a type of real discourse and dialogue with our brothers and sisters, and the best idea wins. That's the way it should be. Right now, we're not even having a discourse and dialogue because most people don't know about the Igbo, or if they do, they dismiss it as being something quaint. It's not quaint. This is real. This is important, and we need to be engaged in this dialogue and discourse.
And you're certainly doing your part. So how did you come to become so knowledgeable about this, Yirmiyahu? Is this like just an interest that landed on you sometime?
Something like that. I mean, look, as I mentioned before, or I guess you mentioned before in the bio, I am of a diverse Jewish background. I have ancestors that went through the Caribbean. I have ancestors that were in the land of Israel. I have ancestors that went through Europe. And so I had a kind of a keen understanding growing up that the history of the Hebrew people is something which is beyond just one local experience. It's something which is really a global phenomenon, and the experience of a civilization that is attempting and succeeding right now to restore its civilization and to change the world as a part of that process. So as a part of my work in advocating for Jewish causes, completely unrelated to this, but just against BDS, advocating the ideas of Zionism, of Jewish revival, all of a sudden I came across what really is millions of people who have the same identity as me, and I didn't know about it. And I was like, how is this possible that somebody like me, who has such passion for our people, doesn't know about millions of our people? It was something that I just couldn't accept. And so I had to get deeper into it. And I had the amazing privilege of studying under great teachers from without and within the Igbo community. Some of them like Remy Alona, who has been a pioneer in basically putting to pen to paper and writing down the history of his people. You know, him and so many others that are really starting to make this their life's work, because they're realizing that there is a huge gap between the collective Jewish world and the Igbo people that we need to help bridge.
And where can people go for more information, Yirmiyahu? Anywhere in particular, or just do general Google searching?
First of all, you could definitely Google search and get a lot of information, because now increasingly there is more being published online. There are a few works that I would definitely recommend to people. The Jewish Identification Among the Igbo in Nigeria by Daniel Liss, who is an Israeli and Swiss anthropologist, is a great work to learn more about this phenomenon. And also there's many different books published by Remy Ilona, who has written extensively about Jewish history, Igbo, Hebrew history, culture, and anthropology.
Well, we've run out of time. All I can say, Yirmiyahu, is that the Igbo people are very lucky to have you as an advocate for them. You do a wonderful job, and may long it continue. And we want to thank you for joining us tonight. It's been absolutely fascinating. I mean, we're down under. We're at the other end of the world, and this is something that's very unheard of here. So thank you for your time, and thank you for being so informative. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a joy.
Okay. Now, just before we go, if you've got an appetite for some more Jewish-themed entertainment, head over to 3ZZZ and listen to Morris Klein's L'chaim program. It's on now. That's at FM 92.3 or 3ZZZ.com.au. That's all we have for tonight. We're back to the hard politics, which we like so much, next week, and we'll have Jonathan Spire. So until next week, we look forward to having you join us again. But for now, it's good night to you all. Bye for now.